Hey there, welcome back to the Sleep Atlas. Tonight, we're going to talk about what many historians have called the single worst year to be alive. Yes, worse than 1347 when the Black Death rolled across Europe. Worse than 1914 when the world decided trench warfare was a good idea. And even worse than the year you personally first discovered low-rise jeans in old family photos. The year was 536 AD. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, does it? Just another dusty number tucked away in the middle of the so-called Dark Ages. But here's the thing, 536 wasn't just dark in the metaphorical sense. It was literally dark. The sun itself dimmed, the world's skies turned grey, crops failed, famine spread, and in its wake came plagues and social collapse. One Byzantine historian of the time described it as a year without sun, and honestly, if you ever feel like you're having a rough week, you might want to compare it with that. But wait, you might be thinking, the worst year ever can't possibly be pinned down to one single year, right? Life is a long and complicated mess, and yet, when modern climatologists and historians started comparing tree rings, ice cores, and dusty old chronicles, a surprising consensus emerged. Around the year 536, something happened. Something so massive that it disrupted weather patterns across the globe for years. Crops failed in Ireland, empires staggered in Asia, and even in the Andes of South America. The scars of climate collapse are recorded in the earth. And the kicker? It may have started with a massive volcanic eruption, or maybe more than one. So tonight, dim your lights, settle into a comfortable spot, and let's walk together through this shadowed year. We'll look at what life would have actually been like if you, by some cosmic mistake, found yourself living in the year 536. Spoiler, you wouldn't like it, not even a little, but at least you'll fall asleep knowing your Wi-Fi outages and overcooked DoorDash orders are nothing compared to ash-choked skies and global famine. Before we begin, if you're new here, don't forget to gently tap that like button and subscribe. It helps keep these historical deep dives flowing. And I'd love to know, what's keeping you up tonight? Let me know in the comments. Maybe it's stress, maybe it's curiosity, or maybe, just maybe, it's the burning desire to know why 1,500 years ago, everyone on Earth woke up to a sun that refused to shine. Chapter 1. When the sun refused to shine. Imagine waking up one morning in the year 536. You're living in a small village somewhere in northern Europe, perhaps Ireland, maybe Scandinavia, or even in the patchwork of Frankish kingdoms that were trying to stitch themselves together in the ruins of Rome. You crawl out of your drafty wooden hut. The fire has gone out during the night, so the interior is damp and chill. You step outside, rubbing your arms against the cold, expecting to squint into the morning sun. But you don't. Instead, you're greeted by a strange, dim twilight. The sun is there, technically, but it's blurred, hazy, like a dull silver disk floating behind a thick veil of smoke. The light is pale, weak, and it casts no real warmth. The world feels wrong. At first, maybe you shrug it off. Weather is weather. Maybe the gods are angry. Maybe it's just fog. But as days turn into weeks, it doesn't get better. The haze lingers. Nights are colder, mornings are bleaker, and crops that should be thriving are beginning to wilt. Your rye doesn't sprout properly. Your oats struggle. Even your turnips, the reliable, ugly friend of every peasant, start to shrivel before they can be pulled from the earth. Hunger begins as a dull ache, a gnawing reminder in your belly that never seems to go away. This is not just your problem. Across Europe and Asia, from Ireland to China, chroniclers recorded the same thing, a mystery fog that dimmed the skies for 18 months. It wasn't fog, of course, but they had no vocabulary for volcanic ash suspended high in the stratosphere. They only knew that the sun seemed weak, like the light of the moon during an eclipse. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year." Farmers from Syria to the shores of Scandinavia noticed their fields failing, and when harvests fail, society fails. Imagine being a peasant tied to the land. You work from dawn until dusk, though in 536 dawn and dusk look disturbingly similar. Your body aches from bending and digging, your hands are cracked, your back is sore, and the yield is pitiful. You may have enough to feed your family for a week, maybe two, but the winter is long and everyone knows famine is coming. People begin to eye their neighbors. Communities start to fracture. Petty theft rises. If someone steals a sack of grain, that could mean your children starve before spring. The priest in the village church tells you it's a punishment from God. Perhaps you believe him, perhaps not, but it doesn't matter. Either way, your stomach is still empty. And what about water? Streams and rivers seem lower. The air is cooler, wetter, carrying a faint acrid tang, almost smoky. You don't understand it, but modern climatologists can explain. A massive eruption, maybe Iceland, maybe North America, blasted sulfuric aerosols into the atmosphere, reflecting sunlight back into space. The result was a year without summer. The temperatures dropped by several degrees globally, enough to devastate agriculture. You of course don't know that. You just know you're cold in June and still cold in August. And the psychological effect? Immense. Humans need the sun, not just for crops, but for mood, for time, for rhythm. Imagine months on end of weak twilight skies, a perpetual sense of evening. No sunrise to greet you with energy, no bright summer afternoons, no sense of passing seasons, just dimness. People thought the end of the world was coming. Can you blame them? Food becomes the obsession. You spend your days searching for anything edible, berries, roots, bark even. In Ireland, annals recorded a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Archaeological evidence in Scandinavia suggests whole communities collapsed, villages abandoned. Imagine eating thin gruel every day, made from whatever scraps you can scrape together. No salt, no herbs, no butter, just warm, grey mush. And disease? Famine weakens everyone, makes them vulnerable. Sickness spreads in the cramped huts. Your child coughs all night. Your neighbor's newborn doesn't make it through the week. Graves are dug shallow, quickly. You don't mourn long. You can't afford to. This was the reality of daily life in 536. Cold, hunger, endless twilight, and fear. Not exactly Instagrammable. And the kicker? This was only the beginning. Within a few years, plague would arrive, as if famine and darkness weren't enough. The Justinian plague, the first wave of bubonic plague in recorded history, would devastate populations already weakened by starvation. But here in 536, you don't know what's coming. You only know that the earth feels broken, the sky is wrong, and tomorrow will probably be worse than today. So, let's take a step back from that little village in northern Europe and widen the lens, because the misery of 536 wasn't just a local phenomenon, it was global, in a way few disasters before it had ever been. Whether you were a farmer in the rolling fields of Ireland, a trader along the Silk Road, or a shepherd in the highlands of Central Asia, the year brought the same ominous signs. Skies dimmed, harvests failed, and life suddenly became much harder. If you were in Ireland, the monks kept careful notes in their annals. They wrote that from 536 to 539, there was a failure of bread, which is a medieval way of saying no grain, no food, no life. Imagine being a farmer who worked all spring planting barley, only to find the stalks short, the heads empty, and the grain shriveled. You walk into your storehouse and see the bins nearly empty. The smell of mold clings to the walls where dampness seeps in. Hunger is not just a passing discomfort, it's the new reality. Now picture yourself instead in China. The chronicles there describe the same dim sun, the same strange cold. They wrote of summer frosts, crops withering before harvest. Frost in summer. It sounds poetic until you're standing in your field in July, watching white crystals coat your rice seedlings. You can try to scrape away the frost, but it doesn't matter. The plant is ruined, and so is your dinner. Famines ripple outward. First, the poorest starve, then the slightly wealthier. Soon, even the well-off are tightening their belts. Hungry crowds grow restless. In some places, there are rumors of uprisings, because when the stomach growls long enough, people stop listening to kings and emperors. In the Middle East, in the bustling cities of the Byzantine Empire, the problem looked a little different but no less dire. The markets in places like Antioch or Constantinople still bustled, but the prices skyrocketed. Bread that once cost a few copper coins suddenly demanded far more. The smell of baked bread was still in the streets, but fewer people could afford it. And when prices rise beyond reach, resentment festers. Shopkeepers feared mobs, while guards tried to keep order. Imagine the constant noise of bargaining, shouting, and hunger-fueled quarrels in narrow stone alleys. Meanwhile, across Central Asia, nomadic tribes who depended on grazing animals were thrown into crisis. Grass didn't grow properly. Pastures shrank. Your herds of sheep or horses, the very backbone of your livelihood, weakened and died. The sounds of bells on the animals' necks became fewer each season, and if your animals die, you die. It's as simple as that. Even in the Andes of South America, far removed from Eurasian chronicles, evidence in ice cores shows unusual changes. Scientists today can see that this wasn't just a European event or an Asian one, but a worldwide phenomenon. And for ordinary people everywhere, it meant one thing: the rhythm of daily life, which depended on the reliable cycle of the seasons, was shattered. Think of how unsettling that must have been. In a pre-scientific world, you relied on patterns: spring thaw, summer planting, autumn harvest, winter rest. You could count on the turning of the seasons. But suddenly, spring felt like winter, summer felt like dusk, and autumn brought nothing worth storing. The rhythm of your life was broken, and with it, your sense of security. Let's be clear, famine in the ancient and medieval world wasn't new. People had always faced poor harvests and lean years. But 536 was different. It wasn't one unlucky harvest or one region hit by drought. It was almost everywhere, all at once. And that made it terrifying, because there was no relief. You couldn't flee to another valley, another town, another kingdom, hoping conditions would be better there. Everywhere you went, the same dim skies hung over your head. So what did people do? They improvised. In Europe, when grain failed, they tried to grind acorns into meal or peel bark to stretch what little flour they had. The taste was bitter, the texture coarse, but it kept people alive just barely. In Asia, families stretched rice with roots and weeds. In the Middle East, traders hiked prices while desperate families watered down their gruel even thinner. You eat less each day, your energy drains away, your body weakens, and even simple tasks, walking to the well, chopping firewood, feel exhausting. And of course, hunger wasn't the only misery. With weak bodies came disease, fevers, coughs, infections, all harder to fight off. Villages grew quieter, not because they were peaceful, but because there were fewer voices. The blacksmith might no longer be heard hammering because he had no customers. The children no longer laughed in the lanes because they were too tired, or worse, gone. Silence hung over communities like another layer of the haze already dimming the skies. You can almost hear it if you imagine yourself there. The soft shuffle of tired feet in muddy paths, the occasional lowing of a cow, thinner now than it should be, the hollow cough of a neighbor, the absence of birdsong because even the animals noticed something was wrong. This was daily life in 536 across continents. It wasn't one dramatic disaster, like an earthquake leveling a city. It was slower, crueler, and far more widespread. A creeping disaster that stretched over months and years. And in a world where survival already balanced on a knife's edge, the haze of 536 tilted the scales heavily against ordinary people. Picture yourself in that world of 536 again. The sky hasn't cleared and the seasons feel broken. Hunger is now part of your daily routine, like drawing water or mending your shoes. But humans are endlessly inventive, especially when desperate. Communities across the known world tried to cope in ways that were practical, spiritual, and sometimes a little absurd. Let's start with the practical. Food, or the lack of it, was the pressing issue. Families did what they could to stretch dwindling supplies. In Europe, peasants stripped bark from trees and ground it into powder to mix with their grain. Imagine the texture of your bread becoming woody, gritty, with a faint bitter aftertaste. Hardly satisfying, but enough to keep a family alive for another day. In Scandinavia, archaeologists have found evidence of people boiling pine needles, attempting to extract whatever trace of nutrition they could. The result? A thin, sour broth that smelled faintly of resin and desperation. Communities also turned to wild foods, roots and tubers, berries, weeds, anything that might be edible. Of course, this led to mistakes. Plants that looked nourishing sometimes turned out to be toxic. You can picture someone boiling up a pot of unfamiliar leaves, only to have the whole family fall ill. A tragic side effect of improvisation. In Asia, rice shortages forced people to eat less familiar grains, sometimes millet, sometimes even wild grasses. Meals were smaller, blander, and far less frequent. The rhythm of 3 meals a day, if that was ever common for the poor, broke down into one meager portion eaten whenever you had enough to cook it. And then there was theft. Hunger has a way of eroding morals. In market towns, guards had to chase off starving peasants who tried to snatch loaves of bread or raid warehouses. The clang of steel and the shouts of officials were more common than before. Some communities tried to enforce harsh punishments to deter theft, but when bellies growl, punishments lose their edge. People risked the lash, or worse, if it meant their children might eat. Of course, not all coping was practical. Much of it was spiritual. When the skies turned dim and the sun looked pale, many believed it was divine punishment. Clerics preached in Europe that humanity had angered God, and only repentance would restore the sun. Priests led processions through villages carrying crosses and relics, chanting prayers into the dim skies. The sound of bells and hymns echoed through the gloom. Did it help the crops grow? Not at all. But it gave people a sense of order, of purpose, when the world itself seemed broken. In Asia, similar responses emerged. Chinese records describe court officials trying to interpret omens. Frost in summer, clearly a sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. Court astrologers pored over the skies, looking for meaning in the faint stars and dim sun. Farmers in the fields carried out their own rituals. burning incense, offering sacrifices, whispering prayers to ancestors, anything to restore balance. And then there were the less noble coping mechanisms, rumors and scapegoats. When disaster strikes, humans look for someone to blame. In small villages, suspicion fell on outsiders, strangers, or anyone who seemed different. A foreign trader might be accused of bringing a curse. A local healer might be whispered about as a witch. Imagine being that unlucky soul, already hungry, already tired, and suddenly the whole community decides you're responsible for the dim skies. Fear can be cruel, and famine sharpens its edge. Communities also fractured in more subtle ways. Families hoarded food, hiding it from neighbors. Villages split apart as people migrated, hoping to find better conditions elsewhere. Some succeeded, finding slightly less barren lands. Others found only more of the same. Archaeology suggests that in parts of Scandinavia, entire villages were abandoned, roof timbers left to collapse, hearths left cold. Imagine walking through one of those villages, silent but for the wind, tools still scattered where they'd last been used, as if everyone simply gave up and walked away. But not every story is bleak. Some communities banded together, pooling resources. A village might decide to ration collectively, giving each family a share. Clergy sometimes opened church granaries to feed the poor, though usually only after extracting promises of loyalty or repentance. And there's evidence that in some regions the crisis actually strengthened communal bonds. Shared suffering can do that, forge solidarity in the face of hardship. Still, the daily reality was dominated by hunger, fear, and a constant search for meaning. Each morning you'd wake to the same dim sky, shuffle out into the cold, and ask yourself the same questions. Will there be food today? Will my children survive the week? Is this the end of the world? Now, sitting here centuries later, it's easy to dismiss those fears. We know it wasn't the apocalypse. We know it was a climate event triggered by volcanic eruptions. But imagine not knowing. Imagine living in a world where the natural order, the rising of the sun, the growth of the crops, had suddenly failed. No science to explain it, no global communication to reassure you that it was happening everywhere, not just in your valley. Just a creeping sense of doom, reinforced by empty stomachs and endless twilight. That was coping in 536. Desperate improvisation, fervent prayer, suspicion of neighbors, and a few fragile attempts at solidarity. Not exactly inspiring, but very, very human. Let's be clear. Hunger was terrible, sickness was worse. But the thing that really gnawed at people in the year 536 was the sky itself. You could try to scrape bark into bread, you could ration grain, you could huddle together for warmth, but you couldn't make the sun shine again. Imagine looking up each morning, waiting for that burst of gold on the horizon, only to see the same dull metallic disk glowing weakly through haze. The world felt permanently stuck at dusk, as though time itself had slipped and refused to move forward. Humans are wired for cycles. We wake with the sun, we rest when it sets. Crops follow seasons, and so do we. But in 536 the cycles collapsed. Summer frosts in China, dim midsummer afternoons in Europe, weeks blurred together because the light was always the same, a pale, cold twilight that stretched from dawn to dusk. Your sense of time became warped. Was it late afternoon? Was it morning? Days felt endless. Seasons felt indistinct. People whispered that the heavens had stopped turning, that the world was broken. The effect on mood must have been immense. Today we know about seasonal affective disorder, the gloom that settles in during long, dark winters. Now imagine that feeling stretching across entire continents for over a year, Anxiety ran like a current through communities. Children cried more, adults muttered in fear, priests and shamans preached harder than ever. You can imagine sitting by the hearth, the smoke prickling your eyes, listening to the silence outside, broken only by the occasional cough or the whine of wind. No bird song in spring, no harvest songs in autumn, just stillness. It must have felt like living under a curse, and of course people tried to explain it. They turned to the frameworks they knew best: religion, myth, and prophecy. In Europe, priests thundered that humanity's sins had blackened the sky. Repent or perish, they said. In China, scholars interpreted it as the emperor losing the mandate of heaven, a cosmic withdrawal of approval. Among Norse communities, this must have looked suspiciously like the Fimbul winter, the long dark winter that in myth heralded Ragnarok, the end of the world. And honestly, if you'd been standing in a Scandinavian field in July, frost crunching under your boots, wouldn't you have thought the same? Dreams and omens grew more powerful in people's minds. If the sun itself was unreliable, then maybe the future could be glimpsed in visions, in the flights of birds, in the pattern of stars, or what little of them could be seen through the haze. Every strange coincidence, every odd occurrence, suddenly carried meaning. A raven croaking at dawn, a bad omen, a calf born with a twisted leg, proof that the world was unraveling. Psychologically, there was also the toll of uncertainty. Hunger you can endure, cold you can fight, but uncertainty is corrosive. How long will this last? Will the sun ever return? No one knew, and uncertainty makes every hardship feel heavier. Each day without change drained hope a little further. When you don't know if tomorrow will be better, tomorrow feels like a threat. Communities responded in different ways. Some doubled down on ritual, processions, sacrifices, prayers, chants, all designed to plead with the unseen powers to restore balance. Imagine the echo of voices singing into the dim sky, candles flickering in the gloom, the smell of incense mingling with the smoky air. For some, it was comforting, a way to feel they were doing something. For others, it was hollow. Rituals failed, the skies stayed grey. Faith wavered or hardened into fanaticism, and then there was the whisper of apocalypse. Across cultures, stories of the end of the world found fresh life. In the Middle East, Christian communities read the dimming of the sun as a sign of the approaching Last Judgment. In Asia, omens were interpreted as cosmic warnings. In the north, sagas of endless winter suddenly felt less like myth and more like prophecy. People genuinely wondered if the world itself was dying, and perhaps the most frightening thing of all was that no one could prove them wrong. The psychological toll wasn't just despair, though. It also reshaped behavior. Some people became more cautious, hoarding what little they had. Others grew reckless, convinced the end was near, so why not drink, feast, or fight while there was time? There's evidence that violence and migration increased in some regions. When the world feels unstable, people become unstable too. But through it all, life carried on in its slow, grinding way. You still had to fetch water, mend clothes, patch roofs, care for children. The ordinary routines of survival went on, even under skies that refused to cooperate. Perhaps that was the cruelest part, the blend of the mundane and the catastrophic. Life was simultaneously normal and profoundly broken. Now, centuries later, we know the truth. The haze was caused by volcanic eruptions, sulfur in the stratosphere scattering sunlight. We can measure it in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. We can trace the famine in tree rings that show years of stunted growth. But in 536, you didn't have that knowledge. You only had your eyes, your hunger, and the endless twilight, and that was enough to make the world feel like it was ending. By the end of 536, the pattern was clear. Whatever this strange haze was, it wasn't leaving. You could wake up every morning, squint into the dull silver sky, and see no change. Crops were gone, livestock were thinning, children were smaller than they should have been. It wasn't just a bad harvest or an unlucky storm season. This was something bigger, something that stretched across villages, kingdoms, continents. And people began to realize, quietly, grimly, that survival meant adjusting to a new, darker world. The toll of the year piled up in layers. Hunger was the foundation. Every day revolved around the question of food. Families grew thinner, cheeks hollowed, the lines around mouths deepened. Even the wealthy, who had granaries to fall back on, started to ration more carefully. Bread loaves shrank, stews became thinner, and feasts grew rarer. The poor, of course, bore the brunt. They were the first to die, the first to disappear from church pews and village squares. Migration followed. When crops failed in one region, people packed up what little they had and moved on, convinced that somewhere else the sun was brighter. A family might abandon their hut, bundle their belongings onto a cart, and head down the muddy road toward the next town. In some places, entire communities uprooted themselves, leaving behind collapsed roofs and empty hearths. Archaeologists find those traces today, villages abandoned suddenly in the mid-6th century, as if the people simply melted into the haze. But migration brought new problems. Refugees arrived hungry, tired, and desperate. Towns already struggling to feed their own suddenly had to absorb newcomers. Tensions rose. Strangers were distrusted. Clashes broke out. If you've ever wondered how fragile social order can be, look to famine. It doesn't take long for hospitality to turn into hostility when the bread runs out. Disease was the next layer of the toll. Malnutrition weakens the body, makes you more vulnerable to illness. Coughs lingered, fevers burned hotter, wounds healed slower. In crowded settlements, sickness spread faster. Families who might have survived hunger fell to illness instead. The sound of hacking coughs became as familiar as the church bell, a constant background to daily life. And graves filled faster than they had in living memory. The toll wasn't just physical, it was psychological too. People grew quieter, more inward. Songs were sung less often. Market chatter was subdued. The joy of festivals, already muted by hunger, vanished almost entirely. What's the point of celebration when the sky itself looks funereal? In written records you can feel the despair. Chroniclers wrote of failure of bread, of a sun without brightness, of cold and hunger lasting year after year. These weren't just poetic phrases. They were cries of communities watching their world slip away. And yet, there was always that fragile thread of hope. Humans cling to it, even in the worst of times. Perhaps next spring the haze will lift, people said. Perhaps the sun will shine again. Perhaps the crops will return. Maybe the gods will relent, or the emperor will pray hard enough, or the ancestors will intercede. You can imagine villagers gathering in the fields at dawn, straining their eyes for just a hint of stronger sunlight, or families whispering prayers over their tiny meals, hoping that tomorrow would be brighter, literally. That hope was fragile, but it kept people moving. It kept them planting seeds, even when they knew the ground was too cold. It kept them tending to animals, even as herds dwindled. It kept them building fires, mending roofs, and enduring, because the alternative, giving up entirely, was unthinkable. Looking back, we know the haze eventually lifted. The sun returned. The seasons, though still unstable, found their rhythm again. But in the thick of 536, you wouldn't have known that. You only knew the hunger, the darkness, the fear, and the faint hope that tomorrow might be different, that perhaps the world wasn't ending after all. And so, as 536 turned into 537, humanity carried on, thinner, sadder, and more cautious, but still alive. That's the remarkable thing. For all the suffering, for all the despair, people endured. And endurance, more than anything else, is the story of daily life in the worst year to be alive. Chapter 2. An Emperor in the Dark. So far, we've walked through the lives of ordinary people in 536, peasants scraping bark into bread, families praying under a sky that refused to shine. But now let's shift the lens upward toward the marble halls of power and one of the most ambitious rulers of the age, Justinian I, Emperor of Byzantium. If you've ever wondered how unlucky timing can get, picture being the man who dreams of restoring the glory of Rome, only to have the sun itself dim on your watch. Talk about bad scheduling. Let's set the scene. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed less than a century before. Rome itself had been sacked by Goths and Vandals. The once mighty empire was reduced to scraps, fractured kingdoms in the west, chaos in the north, and an eastern half still standing in Constantinople. That eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, was Justinian's world. A city of domes, walls, and crowded markets, Constantinople was perched on the Bosphorus Strait, glittering with mosaics and filled with the smell of spices, incense, and the less glamorous stench of sewage running down its crowded alleys. Justinian came to power in 527. He wasn't born into it. He was the nephew of an earlier emperor, Justin I, who had risen through the army ranks. That meant Justinian was technically what you might call new money, not a blue-blood patrician from ancient Rome, but a provincial kid from modern-day Macedonia who studied hard, worked harder, and clawed his way into power. If history were a sitcom, Justinian would be the overachiever, the one always trying just a little too hard to prove himself, and prove himself he did. His vision was simple in words, but nearly impossible in execution. Restore the glory of Rome. He wanted to rebuild the empire, bring back its lost lands, codify its laws, and glorify its God. It was a tall order even in good times, but these weren't good times, because almost as soon as he began his grand project, the world dimmed, crops failed, and famine spread. Still, Justinian refused to give up his plans. Let's pause here and imagine the contrast. In a peasant village outside Antioch, you're boiling roots for dinner, staring into the dim sky, wondering if you'll see spring. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, Justinian is pacing the marble halls of his palace, planning to reconquer Italy. Your worries, food and survival. His worries, hiring generals, raising taxes, and whether he can commission a cathedral so big it will literally shake the heavens. The gap between ruler and ruled was astronomical, but that gap also shaped the narrative. For Justinian, famine and climate collapse weren't reasons to stop. They were obstacles, yes, but obstacles to be overcome, often at the expense of his subjects. His projects, wars, churches, legal reforms, required money. Money meant taxes, and taxes in a time of famine meant squeezing peasants who were already eating bark bread. You can imagine how popular that made him. And yet, Justinian wasn't just ruthless ambition, he was also brilliant. Under his rule, the Byzantine legal code was overhauled into the famous Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation for much of modern European law. He hired generals like Belisarius, who actually did march into Italy and North Africa, clawing back territory that had been lost to barbarian kings. He poured resources into architecture, most famously the Hagia Sophia, that massive domed cathedral in Constantinople that still exists today, a testament to his desire to leave his mark on history. But here's the irony. All this grandeur was unfolding while the skies stayed grey, crops withered, and famine stalked the empire. Imagine commissioning gold mosaics for a cathedral while your subjects starved. It's the kind of contradiction history specializes in. On one side, marble, gold, and imperial ambition. On the other, peasants dying in fields, villages crumbling, and the sense that the apocalypse was near. Justinian himself must have felt the tension. Chronicles say he was deeply pious, constantly framing his actions as service to God. But he was also pragmatic. He needed armies fed, taxes collected, and subjects kept in line. That's the constant challenge of rulers in hard times, balancing the dream of empire with the reality of famine. And for Justinian, that balancing act was about to get even harder, because if the dim sun of 536 wasn't enough, a few years later a new disaster would arrive: plague. For now, though, in this first year of crisis, Justinian pressed on. He saw himself as Rome's last chance at glory, the man who could bridge the gap between the fallen empire of the West and the enduring empire of the East. His people saw him as a demanding ruler, taxing them heavily while the skies dimmed. And historians looking back see the contradiction. One of the most ambitious imperial projects in history, launched in what was arguably the worst time in history to be alive. So, as we step into Justinian's story, keep the contrast in mind. The peasants in the countryside, living in shadow and hunger. The emperor in Constantinople, dreaming of Rome's rebirth under grey skies. Two realities side by side, shaping the fate of the Mediterranean world in the year without sun. Picture Constantinople in the late 530s. The skies above the Bosphorus are still pale, dim, and unsettling. Yet inside the great palace, the atmosphere buzzes with ambition. While peasants in the countryside wonder whether they'll have bread next winter, Emperor Justinian is plotting the recovery of Rome's lost lands. His chosen instrument? A general named Belisarius, one of the most capable military leaders of his age, and one of history's great what-if figures. Belisarius wasn't born into the aristocracy. Like Justinian, he was from the provinces, specifically Thrace. He rose quickly through the ranks, thanks to a combination of natural talent, charisma, and a reputation for loyalty. Imagine a tall, imposing man in polished armor, his presence commanding on the battlefield, yet careful in politics. In a court filled with intrigue and betrayal, loyalty was priceless, and Justinian knew it. Together, emperor and general launched campaigns that, on paper, looked almost insane. North Africa was the first target. The Vandals had conquered it decades before, and their kingdom, centered in Carthage, was wealthy but unstable. In 533, Belisarius set sail with a relatively small force, maybe 15,000 men, and somehow pulled off one of the most astonishing victories in late Roman history. Carthage fell. North Africa was restored to the empire. You can almost hear the cheers in Constantinople as news arrived, the echo of victory trumpets bouncing off the marble walls. But remember, this was happening under the shadow of the year 536. The skies were dim, the crops poor, and famine spread across much of the empire. You might think Justinian would call a halt, focus on feeding his people, shoring up defenses, and stabilizing his realm. But no, conquest was the priority. And so, almost immediately after North Africa, Justinian turned his eyes to Italy. Italy was the symbolic heart of Rome. The city itself had fallen into the hands of the Ostrogoths, Germanic rulers who had made themselves comfortable among the ruins of the empire. If Justinian wanted to truly call himself restorer of the Roman Empire, he had to bring Italy back under his rule. Belisarius was dispatched once again, this time to fight the Goths. Now picture the scene, legions marching into Italy, their banners snapping weakly in the pale dimmed sun, soldiers trudging across the Apennines, their rations already stretched thin. Wars in antiquity always strained logistics, but in the years after 536 they were brutal. Grain shipments were unreliable, horses starved along with men. Armies, already dangerous to civilians, became even more so when supplies ran out. For villagers in Italy, this meant not just famine from bad weather, but armies stripping their fields bare. Belisarius, to his credit, was brilliant. He captured Sicily, then Rome itself, in 536, a symbolic triumph that must have thrilled Justinian. Rome, the eternal city, was once again in imperial hands. Imagine the headlines, if there had been headlines. Rome restored, emperor triumphant, except the reality on the ground was far messier. The city was half ruined, its population small, its aqueducts in disrepair. And outside the gates the Ostrogoths rallied, besieging Rome in a brutal standoff that stretched for a year. Life inside the besieged city mirrored the larger empire's misery. Food grew scarce, walls crumbled, disease spread. People whispered that Justinian's ambition was cursed, that the dim sun was proof of divine disapproval. Belisarius fought fiercely, his tactical genius keeping the Goths at bay. But every victory was fragile, every gain threatened by famine and unrest. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, Justinian faced other crises. The cost of war was immense, and wars don't pay for themselves. He raised taxes, squeezed merchants, and demanded contributions from the church. To the average subject, it must have felt like a cruel irony, starving under dim skies while being taxed to fund distant wars in lands you'd never see. It's as if the empire's priorities were upside down, conquest before bread. Still, the propaganda machine worked. Victories were celebrated in lavish ceremonies. Triumphal arches, mosaics, and sermons praised Justinian as a new Constantine, a new Augustus, chosen by God to restore Rome. The Hagia Sophia, still under construction, was envisioned as the jewel of his reign, its great dome literally bringing heaven to earth. Imagine being a peasant conscripted to haul stone for the project, your stomach empty, your hands blistered, and hearing priests say this was all for God's glory. You might have been less impressed, yet it's impossible to dismiss the scale of Justinian's achievements. Despite famine, despite climate collapse, despite the dimming of the sun, he clawed back parts of North Africa, Italy, and even southern Spain. His empire, at its height, stretched across much of the Mediterranean. For a brief moment, it really looked like Rome had been reborn, but beneath the surface, cracks were spreading, the treasury was drained, the people were weary, and the worst was still to come. Because famine and conquest were only the opening acts. A few years later, in 541, the plague of Justinian would sweep across the empire, killing millions. The haze of 536 had weakened the world, softened it up for disaster, and the plague would deliver the next blow. But even before that, the irony was thick. While Justinian and Belisarius dreamed of empire, their people struggled simply to survive each day under a sky that refused to brighten. Imagine living in Constantinople in the early years of Justinian's reign. On paper, it was one of the greatest cities in the world, a bustling capital of 500,000 people, perched on the Bosphorus, surrounded by massive walls, filled with churches, markets, and palaces. The smell of spices drifted through the bazaars. Merchants shouted their prices in Greek, Latin, and half a dozen other languages, and the sound of hammers echoed from the docks where ships were constantly being built and repaired. It was the jewel of the Mediterranean. But beneath the glitter was discontent. Taxes were high, really high. Justinian's endless projects, wars, cathedrals, law codes, required money, and lots of it. And money had to come from somewhere. That meant squeezing merchants, taxing peasants, and pushing the urban poor into tighter corners. Add to that the strange dimming of the skies after 536, which made food scarcer and prices higher, and you have a population that was hungry, angry, and looking for someone to blame. Now, if you think modern sports fans get rowdy, let me introduce you to the chariot racing factions of Constantinople. The two main groups, the Blues and the Greens, weren't just sports teams. They were massive social organizations with political clout, street gangs, and enormous followings. Imagine football clubs fused with political parties, cults, and organized crime all at once. Supporting your faction wasn't just about cheering at the Hippodrome. It was about identity, loyalty, and sometimes violence in the streets. Justinian, unfortunately, managed to alienate both. In 532, a series of arrests and executions inflamed tensions. Normally, the Blues and Greens hated each other, but suddenly they found common ground. They both hated the emperor. During a chariot race at the Hippodrome, chants of Nika, Nika erupted. The word meant conquer or win, but here it was aimed at the government. What started as chants quickly spiraled into one of the most violent urban revolts in history. For nearly a week, Constantinople burned. Imagine looking out across the city and seeing smoke rising in thick, choking columns. Churches torched, palaces stormed, shops looted. The roar of angry crowds filled the streets, echoing through the stone alleys. People who had spent years muttering in the markets about high taxes and famine now turned that anger into fire and blood. Justinian panicked. For a moment he considered fleeing the city entirely, abandoning the capital to the mob. His courtiers urged him to run, and here, in one of history's great what-if moments, it was his wife, Theodora, who stopped him. Theodora is worth pausing on, a former actress and courtesan who became Justinian's empress. She was sharp, shrewd, and utterly unwilling to give up. According to Procopius, when Justinian wavered, Theodora stood and said, "Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. In other words, better to die as emperor than live as a coward." That speech stiffened Justinian's spine. He ordered Belisarius and his generals to act, and act they did. Troops lured the rioters back into the Hippodrome with promises of negotiation. Once tens of thousands were packed inside, the gates were sealed. Soldiers poured in. What followed was a massacre. Contemporary accounts claim 30,000 people were slaughtered in a single day. The cheers of Nika, Nika, were silenced in blood. The city stank of smoke and fear for weeks afterward. From one angle, it was a victory. Justinian survived, his throne intact. From another, it was a disaster. 30,000 of his subjects dead, entire neighborhoods in ruins. The trust between ruler and people shattered, but Justinian did what he always did. He turned crisis into opportunity. With half the city burned, he ordered a rebuilding campaign. Out of the ashes rose new monuments, new palaces, and, most famously, the Hagia Sophia, his great cathedral, a symbol of divine favor in a world that felt cursed. Still, for the ordinary people, the memory of the riots lingered. You can imagine sitting in a smoky tavern years later, whispering about the time the emperor's troops slaughtered half the city, or telling your children about the day the sky was dark and the streets ran red. For them, Justinian wasn't just the builder of cathedrals or the restorer of Rome. He was the emperor who taxed them into poverty, who let them starve, and who ordered soldiers to cut them down when they protested. The Nika riots reveal the tension at the heart of Justinian's reign. He dreamed of glory, but he ruled over hunger. He wanted to rebuild Rome, but he had to burn parts of Constantinople to do it. He built the Hagia Sophia, yes, but only after its predecessor was destroyed in flames set by his own people. It's a reminder that history's grand monuments often stand on foundations of ashes. And through it all, the dim skies of 536 hung over the empire. The people rioted, the emperor rebuilt, but the sun remained pale. The world was out of joint, and even the greatest ruler of his age couldn't fix it. If Justinian was remembered only for his wars and riots, his reign would be a cautionary tale of overreach. But there's another side to him, quieter, less glamorous, yet more enduring. While Belisarius was marching armies across the Mediterranean, and while Constantinople still smelled of smoke from the Nika riots, Justinian embarked on another project, fixing the law. Now, let's be honest, law doesn't sound exciting. It's paperwork, scrolls, and dusty rules, hardly the stuff of epic sagas. But for the Byzantines, law was the backbone of civilization, and by the 6th century it was a mess. Centuries of Roman decrees, overlapping edicts, contradictory judgments. A legal spaghetti pile, if you will. Imagine trying to figure out if you were allowed to inherit your cousin's goat when the rules contradicted each other depending on which emperor's ruling you dug up. Justinian wasn't having it. He wanted clarity. He wanted one unified code that would strip away centuries of confusion and give the empire a solid legal foundation. And so he gathered a team of jurists led by a brilliant man named Tribonian, a lawyer of immense talent and, according to his critics, immense corruption. Together they launched what became the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. Picture the scene. A group of scribes hunched over desks in candlelight, the smell of wax and ink heavy in the room. Piles of old scrolls and codices stacked high, some crumbling, some barely legible. Tribonian dictating as assistants sorted through hundreds of years of rulings, striking contradictions, smoothing edges, and weaving it all into a coherent whole. Outside, the streets were noisy with hunger and discontent, but inside, the quiet scratch of quills created a text that would outlive famine, riots, and even the Byzantine Empire itself. The result was monumental. 4 main parts: the Codex, collecting imperial laws; the Digest, summarizing centuries of jurists' opinions; the Institutes, a sort of legal textbook for students; and the Novellae, new laws issued during Justinian's reign. It wasn't glamorous, but it was tidy, systematic, and astonishingly influential. If you live in Europe today, or anywhere touched by European colonization, odds are your legal system still has DNA from Justinian's code. That's how long the scratch of those quills has echoed. But here's the irony, and you knew one was coming. While Justinian's jurists were drafting elegant statements about property rights and inheritance, outside the palace walls, people were starving. Laws about grain prices meant little when there was no grain. Regulations about trade rang hollow when merchants had nothing to sell. It's the contrast again. Parchment order in a chaotic world. On paper, justice. In reality, famine and fear. And yet, the law mattered. In a time when the skies dimmed and crops failed, the empire still needed contracts, marriages, taxes, punishments. Life had to go on, even badly. The legal code gave shape to that continuity. If you were a merchant in Antioch or a farmer in Thrace, the law at least told you what was supposed to happen, even if reality laughed in its face. Justinian, of course, saw it differently. For him, the corpus juris civilis wasn't just about practicality. It was about legacy. Wars might be lost, cities might burn, skies might darken, but law could endure. He wanted his empire to stand as a new Rome, not just militarily, but legally and culturally. The code was his way of carving permanence into the shifting sands of a collapsing world. It worked too. While most of Justinian's conquests eventually slipped away, his legal code endured for centuries. Medieval scholars studied it. Renaissance lawyers revived it. Modern Europe built its legal systems on it. In a strange way, the famine-haunted skies of 536 produced not just despair, but clarity. While peasants starved and cities rioted, Justinian and his jurists wrote laws that still govern aspects of daily life today. So the irony is rich. In the worst year to be alive, when the sun itself refused to shine, human beings still found time to argue over property rights, taxes, and marriage contracts. Civilization didn't collapse. It adjusted, codified, and pressed forward. The laws written under those dim skies are, quite literally, still with us. That's the paradox of Justinian's reign. At the same time he was taxing peasants into misery and sending armies on impossible campaigns, he was also giving humanity one of its most enduring gifts, order on paper, a reminder that even in the darkest years people still reach for permanence, for structure, for something that makes sense. By the time the haze of 536 had lingered into the early 540s, Justinian's empire was already under strain. Crops were still faltering, people were still hungry, and his ambitious wars had drained the treasury. You could almost imagine the emperor pacing his palace, looking out at the dim sky and thinking, well, at least it can't get any worse. Except, of course, it did, because that's when the plague arrived. The disease first struck in 541 in Egypt, where grain ships loaded at Alexandria. From there, it spread along the busy trade routes of the Mediterranean, carried in sacks of wheat and on the backs of rats and fleas. Soon it reached Constantinople itself, the beating heart of Justinian's empire, and in a city of 500,000 tightly packed behind walls, the results were catastrophic. Contemporary accounts describe bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. Procopius, the historian who never passed up a chance to highlight Justinian's failures, wrote that 10,000 people were dying in Constantinople each day at the height of the epidemic. The sound of carts rumbling through the streets piled with corpses became a constant background noise. The smell of decay clung to the air. Priests walked the streets with incense, but no amount of spice or smoke could cover it. The disease is now known as bubonic plague, the same one that would devastate Europe centuries later as the Black Death. It caused swellings, fevers, delirium, and death, often within days. In a city already weakened by famine and despair, it cut through the population with terrifying speed. Entire families vanished, shops closed, markets fell silent. Silence in a city that large was its own kind of horror, the sound of absence, of missing voices. And here's the astonishing thing. Justinian himself caught the plague. The emperor who dreamed of restoring Rome, who had survived riots and wars and famines, now found himself bedridden, feverish, on the brink of death. For weeks, the empire held its breath. Would he survive? Who would succeed him? What would happen to the empire if the emperor died in the middle of such chaos? Somehow, against the odds, Justinian pulled through. He survived the plague, though weakened, and returned to ruling. But many of his subjects weren't so lucky. The toll was immense. Estimates vary, but historians suggest the plague killed perhaps a third to half of Constantinople's population. Across the Mediterranean, tens of millions may have died. Fields lay untended, armies shrank, trade withered. The empire's strength was gutted, and this was layered on top of the agricultural collapse that had begun with the year 536. Darkness and famine had prepared the stage, and plague delivered the killing blow. Imagine being an ordinary person then. You've already endured years of dim skies, poor harvests, hunger and high taxes. You've seen riots in the city, armies marching through your fields, and whispers of apocalypse in the air. And then suddenly, people begin to die in waves. Your neighbor collapses with a fever. Your cousin develops a swelling on his neck. The priest prays harder, but it doesn't help. Within a few days, they're gone. Soon, the streets themselves are littered with bodies. You stop counting the funerals because there are too many. You just keep hoping that your own household won't be next. From Justinian's perspective, it was devastating. He had managed to keep his empire intact through famine and revolt. He had rebuilt the Hagia Sophia, reformed the law, and sent armies across the Mediterranean. But now, his empire itself was bleeding people. Taxpayers, soldiers, farmers, merchants, all gone. Victory abroad meant little if there were no people left at home to celebrate it. And yet, Justinian carried on. He continued to legislate, to rebuild, to scheme. It's almost absurd when you think about it. The sun goes dim, crops fail, riots burn his city, plague sweeps through, and he still pushes forward with grand designs. It's admirable in a way, but also tragic, because in the end, his ambitions outstripped his empire's ability to sustain them. Rome was not reborn. The lands he conquered slipped away in later years. His monuments survived, his legal code endured, but his dream of a restored empire faded in the same dim light that had haunted the world since 536. For his subjects, though, the legacy was simpler. They lived through hunger, darkness, and plague. They endured the worst year to be alive, and then its aftermath. And if you asked them about their emperor, they might not talk about his legal code or his cathedrals. They might just remember the taxes, the soldiers, and the silence of a city half dead from plague. This is the biography of Justinian in the shadow of 536, ambition and catastrophe, glory and despair, a ruler who dreamed of eternal Rome in a world that felt like it was ending. Chapter 3. The Mystery of the Vanishing Sun. So far we've walked in the shoes of peasants under grey skies and followed Justinian as he tried to rule an empire through famine, riots, and plague. But let's pause and ask the big question. What actually happened? Why did the sun dim in the first place? Why did crops fail across continents? Why did people from Ireland to China all write about the same strange year? To the people of 536, the answer seemed obvious. Divine punishment, cosmic imbalance, the beginning of the end. Procopius, the Byzantine historian, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness like the moon. In the Irish annals, monks recorded a failure of bread stretching from 536 to 539. In China, court scribes noted summer frosts, strange skies, and famine. Different cultures, different languages, all describing the same thing, a world without reliable sunlight. For centuries, historians didn't know what to make of this. Was it exaggeration? A colourful metaphor? Medieval chroniclers had a flair for drama after all, but the consistency across regions and the archaeological evidence pointed to something real. And then, in the 20th and 21st centuries, scientists began to piece the puzzle together. The first clue came from tree rings. If you cut open a tree and look at its rings, you can see how much it grew each year. Thick rings mean good conditions, warm sun, plenty of rain. Thin rings mean stress, drought, cold, or something else that stunted growth. When scientists looked at tree rings from Ireland, Scandinavia, and even the Americas, they noticed something remarkable. Around 536, the rings suddenly narrowed. Growth was stunted across the board. The trees were telling the same story as the chronicles. Something had gone very wrong with the climate. The second clue came from ice cores. In Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drilled deep into the ice, pulling up cylinders of frozen history. Each layer holds chemical traces of the atmosphere at the time it fell as snow. Around 536, they found high levels of sulfur, the chemical fingerprint of volcanic eruptions. Not just a little sulfur, but massive deposits, the kind you only see after cataclysmic explosions. The picture began to sharpen. The dim sun wasn't magic or God or apocalypse, it was volcanoes. Sometime around 536, one or more enormous eruptions blasted sulfur into the stratosphere. High above the clouds, those particles spread around the globe, reflecting sunlight back into space. The result: skies dimmed, temperatures dropped, harvests failed. A volcanic winter. But where did it happen? That's still debated. Some evidence points to Iceland, where volcanic eruptions could have sent ash swirling across the northern hemisphere. Other studies suggest volcanoes in Central America or even North America might have been involved. There's also evidence of another eruption around 540, possibly in El Salvador, which would explain why the cold, dim years dragged on for so long. It may have been not one eruption, but two or three striking in quick succession, like nature delivering not just one punch, but a brutal combination. Think about how terrifying that must have felt to people at the time. They had no idea about atmospheric sulfur or volcanic plumes. They just knew the sun was pale, the air felt cold, and crops wouldn't grow. From their perspective, the universe itself had broken, and honestly, even with our scientific hindsight, it's still eerie. Imagine the entire planet dimming, as if someone had turned down the brightness dial on Earth. Archaeology gives us glimpses of how people responded. In Scandinavia, mass sacrifices of gold objects appear in the archaeological record around this time. Beautiful gold jewelry, coins and treasures deliberately buried in the ground or thrown into bogs. Scholars think it was an offering to the gods, a desperate attempt to bring the sun back. Imagine the scene, villagers gathering at a sacred site, the air cold and dim as they cast shimmering bracelets and necklaces into the earth, hoping the gods would notice. The glitter of gold disappearing into the mud as the sky above remained grey. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, tree ring data suggests droughts and crop failures. In China, records describe famine and frost. The evidence stacks up. The year 536 really was a global event. Not apocalypse, but atmosphere. Not divine punishment, but geology. And yet, for the people living through it, the difference hardly mattered. The experience was the same. Hunger, fear, uncertainty, and the creeping sense that the world itself was ending. So when historians today call 536 the worst year to be alive, it isn't just poetic exaggeration. It's grounded in evidence, in the rings of trees, the chemistry of ice, the layers of earth, and the words of long-dead chroniclers who all saw the same strange darkened sky. When you hear Ice Age, you probably think of glaciers, mammoths, and people wrapped in furs hunting with spears. The late antique Little Ice Age wasn't that dramatic. but for the people of the 6th century it might as well have been. After the haze of 536, the climate didn't simply snap back to normal. Instead, the planet entered a decades-long period of unusual cold, poor harvests, and unpredictable weather. For societies already fragile, it was the beginning of a long chain of problems. Scientists studying ice cores and tree rings see it clearly. The narrow rings in European trees don't just last a single year, they persist for much of the late 6th century. Temperatures dipped by an average of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius across the northern hemisphere. That doesn't sound like much, but it was enough to shorten growing seasons, stunt crops, and trigger repeated famines. Imagine living in a world where the reliable rhythm of planting and harvesting was disrupted not just once, but over and over for decades. In Europe, this meant a string of poor harvests that left entire regions weakened. Archaeological digs in Scandinavia show abandoned farms and villages as if people simply walked away when the land no longer yielded enough to survive. Some scholars suggest these harsh conditions contributed to the great migrations of the era as Germanic tribes, Slavs, and others moved in search of better land. Hunger, after all, is one of the greatest motivators in history. In Ireland, annals record a devastating famine that lasted years. In China, frost and droughts are noted well into the 540s. Even in the Middle East, where food production was usually more reliable, grain shortages drove up prices and caused unrest. The late antique Little Ice Age was global, and it touched nearly every society in some way. And remember, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Politics, wars, and ambitions were already straining resources. Justinian was trying to reconquer the Western Empire. In Persia, the Sasanian dynasty was locked in conflict with Byzantium. In Central Asia, nomadic tribes were moving, competing, clashing. Layer environmental collapse on top of all that, and you have a recipe for upheaval. What makes this period so striking is how it reveals the fragility of ancient societies. A few degrees of cooling, a few years of dim skies, and suddenly trade routes falter, empires struggle, and entire communities vanish from the map. Today, with modern technology, irrigation, and global food supply chains, we feel more insulated. But in the 6th century, if your barley failed, there was no backup plan. No imports from another continent, no canned goods to fall back on. Hunger wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. There's even a chilling theory that this climatic downturn helped pave the way for the spread of plague. Malnourished populations are more vulnerable to disease, and rats, the plague's most infamous carriers, thrive in unstable conditions, moving with trade and migration. Famine softened societies and plague struck the final blow. The timing is too neat to ignore. A volcanic winter, decades of cold, then the Justinianic plague sweeping across the weakened empire. Archaeology gives us glimpses of how different cultures interpreted and responded to this drawn-out crisis. In Northern Europe, the mass deposit of gold I mentioned earlier, jewelry buried or thrown into bogs, wasn't a one-off act. It stretched across decades, suggesting repeated sacrifices to the gods, desperate attempts to bring back warmth and sunlight. In the Andes, evidence of drought suggests similar stresses, though recorded less in words and more in soil layers and lake sediments. In China, dynastic histories mention strange celestial events and natural disasters as signs of heaven's displeasure. Everywhere, people struggle to understand why the world seemed to have slipped off its axis. The late antique Little Ice Age lasted into the 7th century. Think about that. If you were a child born in 536, you could grow into old age without ever remembering a time when the climate felt normal. Your entire life would be shaped by dimmer skies, shorter growing seasons, and the constant presence of hunger and fear. Generations lived and died under its shadow, and yet life went on. Villages adapted, crops shifted, societies migrated. Some empires fell, others rose. In the long run, humanity endured, but in the short run, it felt like the earth itself had turned against them. And for many, it must have seemed like the apocalypse wasn't a single event, but a long, slow decline. That's the unsettling mystery of the year 536. It wasn't just a bad year, it was the start of a bad century, and the traces of that climatic downturn are still locked in ice, trees, and ruins today. When the sun dimmed in 536, people didn't shrug and say, "Ah, volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere." They didn't have climate science, ice cores, or even a concept of the globe as a connected system. What they had were myths, faiths, and cultural stories, and they leaned heavily on them to make sense of a world that seemed to be unraveling. In Europe, the Christian church saw the darkness as divine punishment. Sermons thundered about sin, about God withdrawing his light from a wicked humanity. The dim sun felt biblical, like one of the plagues of Egypt replayed on a cosmic scale. For a peasant huddled in a smoky church, the dim light filtering through stained glass, the connection would have seemed obvious: repent or perish. Theologians speculated about the end times, interpreting the famine and strange skies as signs of the approaching Last Judgment. The book of Revelation suddenly felt less like metaphor and more like the evening news. In Scandinavia, archaeology shows something equally haunting. Around the mid-6th century, enormous deposits of gold, jewelry, coins, and ornaments were buried or thrown into lakes and bogs. These weren't accidental hoards hidden in times of war. They were deliberate offerings. Imagine villagers gathering under the dim sky, the air chill even in summer, as they cast their most precious objects into the earth or water. Bracelets, pendants, coins, all glittering briefly before sinking into mud. It wasn't just sacrifice, it was desperation. Scholars believe these were offerings to the gods, pleas for the return of the sun. And when you think about it, it makes sense. If the sky has gone wrong, surely the gods must be appeased. Myths of endless winter may also have roots in this era. In Norse mythology, there's the Fimbulwinter, a long, unending winter that precedes Ragnarok, the end of the world. Some historians think this legend was shaped, at least in part, by memories of the 6th century climate collapse. Imagine generations telling their children about the years when summer frosts came, when the sun dimmed, when food ran out. Over time, the memory becomes myth. A great winter, the herald of the end. In the Middle East, Christian and Zoroastrian communities saw similar omens. For Christians, famine and plague seemed to echo biblical prophecy. For Zoroastrians, cosmic imbalance meant the eternal struggle between good and evil was tipping dangerously. In China, the court chronicles framed the dim sun as a sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine approval needed to rule. Strange celestial events were taken as warnings, reminders that human governance and cosmic order were tied together. If the skies were wrong, so was the ruler. The psychological weight of these interpretations can't be overstated. It wasn't just hunger, it was cosmic dread. The feeling that the universe itself was unraveling, that the natural order was broken, that humanity was hurtling toward an ending it couldn't prevent. In taverns and marketplaces, whispers spread. Is this the end? Will the sun ever return? Do the gods even care? Archaeology adds eerie layers to this. In some regions, burials from the period show evidence of malnutrition and disease, bones thinner, growth stunted, lives cut short. In others, evidence of mass abandonment. Entire settlements left empty, timbers collapsed, tools scattered. Combine this with the gold sacrifices in the north and the sermons of doom in the south, and you get a picture of a world gripped not just by famine but by fear. And yet culture didn't stop. People still carved runestones, still copied manuscripts, still built temples and churches. Even in the face of famine and dim skies, humans clung to meaning. That's what myths and rituals do. They make the unbearable at least narratable. They turn hunger into sacrifice, fear into prophecy, darkness into divine metaphor. And while they didn't bring the sun back any faster, they gave people a framework for enduring the inexplicable. From our vantage point, it's easy to smile at these interpretations. Volcanoes, not gods, caused the darkness. Climate, not prophecy, drove famine. But step into their shoes for a moment. No science, no global communication, just a dim sun and a failing harvest. You'd reach for your stories too. You'd cling to ritual, to sacrifice, to prophecy, because without them, all you'd have left was silence and hunger. So the mystery of 536 wasn't just geological, it was cultural. It reshaped how people saw the world, how they explained disaster, how they imagined the future. For some, it meant repentance. For others, sacrifice. For still others, prophecy of the end. Different answers to the same question. Why has the sun abandoned us? For over 1,000 years, the year 536 lingered in chronicles as a strange, unsettling memory. A year when the sun grew dim, when famine spread, when the world seemed off balance. For medieval writers, it was a sign of divine wrath. For later historians, it was a curiosity, a half-remembered exaggeration. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, scientists finally began to piece together what really happened. The story of how they solved it is almost as fascinating as the disaster itself. The first clues came from trees. Trees, after all, are meticulous record keepers. Every year they add a new ring, and those rings capture how good or bad that year was. A fat ring means warm temperatures and plenty of growth. A skinny ring means cold, drought, or stress. When dendrochronologists, that's the fancy word for tree ring scientists, looked at samples from Europe and Asia, they noticed something peculiar. Around 536, the rings all narrowed sharply. Growth plummeted. The same pattern appeared in trees from Ireland, Scandinavia, and even across the Atlantic in North America. That wasn't local bad weather. That was global disruption. The next piece came from ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, researchers drilled deep into the ice sheets, pulling out cylinders of compacted snow that stretch back thousands of years. Each layer captures dust, chemicals, and traces of the atmosphere from the year it fell. And around the layer corresponding to 536, scientists found something striking: high levels of sulfur and volcanic ash particles, the fingerprints of a colossal volcanic eruption. That's when the picture started to sharpen. The dim sun described by Procopius wasn't metaphorical. It was a literal atmospheric veil. Sulfur aerosols blasted high into the stratosphere by volcanic explosions. Up there, the particles spread around the globe, scattering sunlight, cooling temperatures, and creating the eerie, pale skies people recorded. But where was the volcano? That part is still debated. Some evidence points to Iceland, where eruptions could have blanketed the northern hemisphere with ash. Others suggest volcanoes in Central America, perhaps even El Salvador, where the Ilopango eruption around this period was massive enough to scar the landscape for centuries. There's also evidence of a second eruption around 540, possibly in another location, which would explain why the climate remained unstable for decades. It may not have been one eruption, but two or even three in quick succession. a 1-2 punch from the Earth itself. The science kept stacking up. Sediment layers in lakes showed unusual chemical signatures. Pollen samples revealed sudden declines in crops. Even oral traditions in distant places seemed to echo memories of strange skies and hunger. The more evidence scientists gathered, the clearer it became. The year 536 wasn't an exaggeration. It was real and it was global. And yet, even with science, the mystery retains some of its eeriness. We can explain the mechanism: volcanoes, aerosols, climate disruption, but the scale still boggles the mind. One eruption in a time before industrial smoke or nuclear weapons was powerful enough to dim the entire planet's sun for over a year. Imagine standing in Ireland watching your barley fail while the cores lay thousands of miles away. In a volcano you'd never heard of. Invisible connections, global consequences. There's also a humbling lesson here. For all our technology, we're still vulnerable to the same planetary forces. A truly massive eruption today could, in theory, trigger a similar volcanic winter. Planes might ground, crops might fail, supply chains would collapse. We'd have more science, yes, but the same sun, the same sky, the same fragile dependence on agriculture. The story of 536 is ancient, but it's also timeless. So, in a way, modern archaeology and science didn't just solve a historical riddle. They reminded us of something we'd rather forget, that human civilization, no matter how powerful it feels, still lives at the mercy of the earth. Volcanoes don't care about empires. Ash doesn't respect borders. And in 536, the planet gave humanity a cold, dim reminder of just how small we really are. By now, the outlines of the mystery are clear. Around the year 536, one or more colossal volcanic eruptions darkened the skies, chilled the climate, and set off famine, migration, and despair. We've seen how contemporaries recorded it, how archaeology confirmed it, how science explained it. But the story doesn't end with explanation. The echoes of 536 rippled through human culture, leaving traces in myths, religions, and even in the way we think about resilience today. Let's start with myth. In Northern Europe, the Norse legends of Fimbulwinter, a great 3-year winter that precedes the end of the world, may have roots in memories of this time. Picture generations telling their children about summers when frost bit the fields, when the sun gave no warmth, when hunger was constant. Over time, those stories hardened into mythology, the endless winter that heralds Ragnarok. In this way, the pain of 536 became immortal, woven into cultural memory as prophecy. In Christian lands, the darkness was read through the lens of apocalypse. Priests thundered from pulpits that the dim sun was a warning of the last judgment. Revelation's imagery, the sun darkened, famine sweeping the earth, suddenly seemed less symbolic and more literal. For peasants already hungry, the connection was obvious. Every failed harvest was a sermon in itself, reinforcing the idea that the end of the world might be at hand. In the Middle East and Asia, the echoes were similar. Chinese chronicles described unusual celestial events, frost in summer and famine. Court scholars interpreted these as signs that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. Disasters weren't just natural events, they were cosmic verdicts. A dim sun wasn't just bad weather, it was politics, morality, and divine will written across the sky. Even today, the echoes remain. Modern scientists have traced the volcanic winter in tree rings, ice cores, and lake sediments. But what's striking is how closely the scientific data matches the human accounts. Procopius' description of a pale, moon-like sun, the Irish monk's lament of a failure of bread, Chinese records of summer frosts, Science provides the mechanism, but the lived experience is preserved in words, stark, frightened, bewildered, and the combination of the two, science and story, gives us the full picture. There's also something deeply human in the way societies responded. When the world broke, they didn't just collapse. They sacrificed gold, they built churches, they wrote chronicles, they wove myths, they searched for meaning in the chaos. That's what humans do. We try to make sense of what makes no sense. We try to stitch order onto disorder. It doesn't always fix the problem. Gold in a bog doesn't bring back the sun, but it gives people a way to endure, and resilience is the final echo. The late antique Little Ice Age dragged on for decades. Plague followed famine, empires stumbled, villages emptied, and yet humanity endured. Farmers still planted, monks still copied manuscripts, traders still set sail, parents still told stories to their children by firelight. The darkness didn't break them. It scarred them, yes, but it also shaped them. When we call 536 the worst year to be alive, it's easy to dwell on the despair. And certainly, for those who lived through it, the hunger and fear were overwhelming. But there's another side to the story. Survival. Against dim skies, against famine, against plague, people kept going. The echoes of their endurance are still with us, in laws, in myths, in faiths, in the very fact that we can sit here tonight, thousands of years later, talking about their struggles. So the mystery of 536 isn't just about what caused the darkness. It's about how humans lived through it, how they interpreted it, how they carried it forward in memory. Science has solved the riddle of the dim sun, but the deeper mystery, how people endured and what it meant to them, is something only history, archaeology, and imagination together can answer. Chapter 4. Feasts in the Shadow of Famine. So far we've lingered in smoky peasant huts, trudged through ruined harvests, and stood in the shoes of ordinary people who watched their children go hungry while the skies dimmed overhead. But what about the other side of society? Because while famine gnawed at villages and plague swept the streets, the Byzantine elite lived in a very different world, one of marble palaces, golden mosaics, and banquets that went on even when the empire itself seemed to be collapsing. Step inside Constantinople's great palace. The air here smells not of damp earth and smoke, but of incense, perfumes, and roasted meats. The floors are tiled with glittering mosaics, geometric patterns in red, gold, and green. Columns of marble rise overhead, cool to the touch, polished smooth. The walls are hung with silks imported at great cost from China. Outside, the sky might be pale and the wind might carry the sting of famine, but inside, the palace glows with candlelight and wealth. For the imperial family and the aristocracy, daily life was cushioned from the worst of the crisis. Food shortages certainly touched them. The grain shipments arriving from Egypt were smaller, the markets thinner. But when supplies were scarce, the poor felt it first. If you were an aristocrat, you could still arrange for wheat to be delivered to your storerooms. You could still buy fruit and meat at inflated prices. You could still sit down to meals that, while not as lavish as in previous years, were plentiful compared to the gruel of the commoners. Imagine the contrast. Outside the palace walls, a mother waters down thin porridge so her children might survive another day. Inside, nobles dip bread into honey, sip wine from silver cups, and discuss politics. For them, the dimmed sun was unsettling, yes, but not fatal. It was a topic of conversation at banquets, not the end of every meal. Life in the palace also meant entertainment. The hippodrome, the great chariot racing arena, still hosted races, though tensions ran high after the Nika riots. The sound of cheering crowds still filled the air even as famine loomed. Music, theater, and intellectual debates continued in elite circles. The educated classes read Aristotle, debated theology, and commissioned mosaics, even while peasants outside the city walls were abandoning their farms. Religion, too, took on a different hue for the elite. In village churches, sermons were about survival, repentance, and the looming apocalypse. But in imperial chapels, the focus was on divine destiny, on the emperor's role as God's chosen ruler. Priests told the wealthy that Justinian's victories and his building projects were proof of divine favor, even as the skies contradicted them. Imagine standing in the glittering Hagia Sophia, incense curling upward, choir voices echoing in the dim light, and being told the empire was blessed. The grandeur of the space alone might have convinced you, even as famine stalked the streets outside. For aristocrats, the crisis was less about survival and more about inconvenience. Imported luxuries were harder to obtain, feasts were smaller, travel was more dangerous, with bandits and hungry refugees crowding the roads. But these were inconveniences of comfort, not matters of life and death. The poor starved, the elite adjusted. That's always been the cruel symmetry of history. Still, the dim skies couldn't be ignored entirely. Even in the palace, people noticed the pale sun, the cold summers, the strange atmosphere. It was a reminder that no amount of marble, gold, or silk could insulate the empire's elite from nature's reach. They dined well, yes, but they dined under the same eerie twilight as everyone else. The apocalypse may have been slower to reach their tables, but it still loomed in the distance. That was life behind the palace walls in 536, comfort and wealth preserved, but shadowed by unease, a world where nobles feasted while peasants starved, where cathedrals rose while villages crumbled, and where the elite carried on as though eternity belonged to them, all under a sun that refused to shine. If the imperial palace was a bubble of marble and silk, the markets of Constantinople and other great cities were where the reality of 536 played out more visibly. Here, among the stalls of bakers, butchers, spice sellers, and cloth merchants, the tension between famine and wealth was sharpest. Merchants were the middle tier of society, not emperors and generals, but not peasants either. They lived in stone houses rather than drafty huts, wore dyed tunics instead of scratchy wool, and had access to foods and goods most ordinary people only dreamed of. And yet their fortunes rose and fell with the tides of famine and scarcity. Imagine walking through the Maze, Constantinople's main street, under that pale sky. Stalls still bustle with activity, but the mood has shifted. Bread is stacked in smaller loaves, sold for higher prices. Chickpeas and lentils are measured out more carefully, weighed against coins that suddenly seem too few. The smell of spices still lingers, cinnamon, pepper, cloves brought along the Silk Road, but they're luxuries, bought only by the rich. For most, it's the sharp tang of vinegar on spoiled grain, or the acrid smell of dried fish that fills the air. Merchants thrived on scarcity, at least some of them did. A baker who hoarded grain could sell it later at outrageous prices. A trader with access to imported wheat could demand double, even triple, the usual cost. In times of famine, the market doesn't disappear, it just becomes crueler. Coins change hands faster, desperation thickens, and profit comes at the expense of hunger. For others, though, the crisis was ruinous. When supply chains broke down, merchants with no access to hoarded goods saw their businesses collapse. Caravans failed to arrive. Ships carrying grain ran late or never made it at all. Markets grew tense. Buyers accused sellers of cheating them. Sellers accused buyers of theft. Guards patrolled, but the occasional riot broke out anyway, sparked by rumors of hidden grain or unfair prices. And then there was the wealthy merchant class, the ones who did manage to hoard, who had storage warehouses along the harbor, who struck deals with imperial officials to secure grain shipments from Egypt. For them, famine became an opportunity. Imagine sitting in your townhouse overlooking the Bosphorus, sipping watered wine, knowing that the sacks of wheat in your storeroom could buy you land, influence, maybe even a title. Hunger was currency. Those who controlled food controlled people. The ethics of it, of course, were murky. Was it exploitation or just survival at a higher level? To the merchant, it was business. To the hungry, it was cruelty. The church tried to mediate, preaching against hoarding and price gouging, but sermons only went so far. When the stomach growls, morality fades. Still, the life of the wealthy merchant wasn't free from anxiety. The dim skies were unsettling for everyone. Ships could be delayed by storms. Crops in Egypt or Syria, which supplied much of Constantinople's grain, also suffered from the cold and frost. If too many shipments failed, even the wealthy could find themselves in danger. Grain riots were infamous. Hungry mobs could turn violent, and merchants were easy scapegoats. You can imagine a merchant locking his storeroom doors at night, glancing nervously at the pale light through the shutters, wondering if tomorrow's market would bring profit or an angry crowd. Beyond Constantinople, in the smaller cities of the empire, the merchant elite played an even bigger role. In Antioch, Alexandria, and Thessalonica, wealthy traders were often the ones financing civic projects, sponsoring churches and paying for festivals. During times of famine, their role became double-edged. On one hand, they were expected to provide charity, to open their warehouses to feed the poor. On the other, they were tempted to guard their wealth, to wait for higher prices. Some did one, some did the other. History doesn't record their names, but archaeology leaves hints. Uneven wealth distribution in burials, hoards of coins hidden in floors, signs of sudden abandonment when tensions boiled over. So, life for the wealthy merchant in 536 was a balancing act. Profit versus risk, hoarding versus charity, safety versus resentment. They lived better than the peasants, certainly, with fuller bowls and thicker clothes. But they also lived closer to the knife edge of public anger. The palace might be untouchable, but the market was not. And in the dim light of 536, where every grain of wheat mattered, being a merchant was both opportunity and danger. In an age when the sun itself dimmed, religion was more than comfort. It was explanation, authority, and in many ways control. And no institution wielded more influence in the Byzantine world than the church. For the poor, the church was often the only place to turn for solace. For the wealthy, it was a shield, a stage, and sometimes a weapon. Step inside the great basilicas of Constantinople in the 530s. The outside world is pale and cold, the streets filled with hungry beggars, the markets tense with shortages, but inside the church everything is different. The air is heavy with incense. Candles flicker in golden holders. Mosaics of Christ and the saints shimmer in the dim light. Their faces calm, eternal, unchanging. Choirs sing in tones that echo through the cavernous space. For a few hours at least you can forget the strange skies outside. But the church didn't just offer comfort, it offered explanation. Priests and bishops told their congregations that the dim sun was a message from God. Humanity had sinned, and famine was the punishment. Repentance, fasting, and prayer might bring relief. For peasants, this message was terrifying but also empowering in its way. If disaster was divine judgment, then perhaps they could influence it through faith. Processions wound through city streets carrying relics and icons, voices chanting for mercy under the pale sky. For the clergy, though, the crisis was also an opportunity. Churches became centers of power as much as centers of worship. People brought offerings, coins, jewelry, grain, hoping to win divine favor. Wealthy patrons funded new chapels and monasteries, not just out of piety, but as a way to show their power and generosity. An aristocrat who donated to the church could claim both divine approval and public admiration. It was insurance for the soul and prestige for the name. The higher clergy, bishops, and patriarchs often lived as comfortably as nobles. Their tables were not empty. Their houses were not cold. They wore robes of fine cloth, dined on meats and wines, and presided over services in glittering basilicas. While peasants starved, bishops argued over theology. Was Christ's nature divine, human, or both? In debates that could shake the empire. These theological disputes might sound abstract, but they held political weight. Emperors backed one side or the other, and bishops became kingmakers as well as shepherds of souls. At the same time, the church did provide real relief. Monasteries distributed bread, sometimes opening their storerooms when famine grew severe. Clergy organized almsgiving, feeding the poorest of the poor. In villages, priests were often the only figures of authority who stayed when nobles fled. They baptized children, buried the dead, comforted the grieving. For many, the church was the only thread of stability in a collapsing world. But the divide between rich and poor was still sharp, even within religion. The peasants prayed for survival. The wealthy prayed for legacy. A farmer might kneel barefoot on the cold stone floor, begging for enough food to see his children through the winter. A nobleman might kneel a few feet away, offering a donation of gold in hopes of securing his family's place in heaven. Both prayed under the same dim light, but for very different things. And then there was the emperor himself. Justinian saw religion not just as faith, but as policy. He styled himself as God's chosen ruler, defender of orthodoxy, protector of the church. The Hagia Sophia, which he ordered rebuilt after the Nika riots, wasn't just a cathedral, it was a statement. Its massive dome, seemingly suspended by light, was meant to awe worshippers into believing that heaven itself touched Constantinople. Imagine standing under that dome as chants echoed, incense curled, and mosaics glimmered, while outside fields lay barren. It was theater on a cosmic scale. So the church in 536 played a double role. It comforted and it controlled. It preached repentance and collected wealth. It gave bread to the starving and dined with emperors. It interpreted the darkness as divine will and used it to reinforce its authority. For ordinary people, faith was survival. For the elite clergy, it was also power. That was the church's world in the worst year to be alive. Candles and incense inside, famine and fear outside. And in that contrast, you see the strange truth of 536. Even in disaster, human institutions adapt, endure, and sometimes thrive. If you were one of the lucky few in 536, an aristocrat in Constantinople, or a wealthy landowner in the provinces, your life looked very different from that of the farmers scraping bark into bread. You lived in a world of marble halls, jeweled cups, and silken curtains where hunger was someone else's problem and famine was a distant rumor. Picture a noble's townhouse in Constantinople. The walls are painted with frescoes, vines curling, birds perched, mythological scenes in soft colors. Floors are laid in mosaics, tesserae glinting in candlelight. Servants hurry through the corridors carrying trays of fruit, bread, and roasted meats. Even in times of scarcity, the wealthy could secure food through connections, hoarded supplies, or sheer buying power. A loaf of bread that cost a commoner a week's wages was nothing to a senator with warehouses full of grain. Meals for the elite were still banquets, even if slightly pared down. Guests reclined on couches as servants poured wine, imported if possible, local if not. Honey-sweetened pastries, lamb seasoned with herbs, olives and cheeses still appeared on the table. Maybe the peaches were smaller, maybe the fish less fresh, but compared to the watery porridge of the poor, it was abundance, and abundance was more than sustenance. It was performance. Sharing a banquet in a darkened world was a way of saying, we are untouched, we are eternal. The aristocracy also surrounded themselves with luxury goods that spoke of global trade, even in uncertain times. Silks from China, dyed brilliant purples and reds, draped from their shoulders. Gold jewelry gleamed in candlelight. Perfumes from Arabia scented their rooms. These luxuries were more than comfort. They were insulation. They created an artificial brightness in a world where the sun itself refused to shine. And let's not forget leisure. While peasants worked from dawn to dusk simply to survive, the wealthy filled their days with more comfortable pursuits. Aristocrats strolled through gardens shaded by colonnades, discussing philosophy or theology. They visited public baths, where mosaics sparkled under dim light, steam rising from marble pools. They watched performances, musicians playing lyres and flutes while dancers twirled in the glow of oil lamps. Even as famine loomed, the aristocracy sought distraction in art, conversation, and the pleasures of the senses. Of course, not all was serene. The wealthy were not blind to the unrest outside their walls. Grain riots, refugees, and whispers of revolt made them nervous. They reinforced their townhouses with higher walls, hired guards to protect their warehouses, and curried favor with bishops and imperial officials. Wealth insulated them, but it also painted a target on their backs. A hungry mob could turn quickly, and even the richest nobleman's marble courtyard could be breached if desperation boiled over. Yet many of them saw disaster as opportunity. When farmers abandoned their land, aristocrats bought it up cheaply, expanding their estates. When merchants went bankrupt, nobles acquired their warehouses. Wealth consolidated as the poor suffered. By the time famine subsided, the gap between rich and poor was wider than ever. Imagine the contrast most vividly in Constantinople itself. In one quarter of the city, an aristocratic banquet, servants refilling cups, laughter echoing under frescoed ceilings. In another, a poor family crouched in a cold hovel, dividing a crust of bread into thin slices to make it last. Both lived under the same dim sky, but their experiences of 536 were worlds apart. The aristocracy's survival strategy was simple: leverage wealth to shield against crisis. And it worked. Their villas still stood, their wardrobes still gleamed, their children still ate. But history is always watching. The chronicles don't remember their feasts. They remember the famine, the riots, the plague. The aristocrats may have lived comfortably, but they lived in the shadow of events far larger than themselves. Events that no amount of silk or gold could truly hold back. If there is one image that captures the contrast of 536, it is this. Outside the city walls, peasants starve beneath a dim sun. Inside, masons and architects lay the foundations of one of the greatest buildings of the ancient world, the Hagia Sophia. For Justinian and the Byzantine elite, famine and plague were temporary. But marble and stone? That was eternal. And so, even as food ran scarce and riots had only recently scorched Constantinople, the emperor poured resources into construction. He wanted a cathedral unlike any the world had ever seen, a house of God that would proclaim divine favor over his reign. Step inside the Hagia Sophia as it stood in Justinian's time. The scent of freshly cut stone still lingers, mingling with incense. Sunlight, dim though it is, filters through massive windows, catching on golden mosaics of Christ and the saints. The dome rises overhead, so vast and perfect it seems to float on air. To stand there was to feel that heaven had bent down to touch earth. That was the point. While peasants begged for bread, emperors and bishops built eternity. The symbolism was deliberate. In a time when the world itself seemed fragile, when skies refused to brighten and famine pressed down on the empire, the Hagia Sophia stood as defiance. It was an anchor, a promise that civilization, at least for the wealthy and powerful, would not only endure but triumph. The building itself seemed to mock the chaos outside. You may starve, you may riot, but look, we build forever. Other monuments rose too, aqueducts repaired, palaces expanded, fortifications strengthened. For the elite, crisis was a chance to demonstrate resilience through stone and mortar. Each structure was propaganda, proof that the empire remained stable, that God still smiled on its rulers, that the world was not ending after all. But for ordinary people, those monuments told a different story. Imagine trudging into Constantinople, thin and desperate, and seeing the gleaming dome of Hagia Sophia rising above the skyline. You'd marvel, yes, but you'd also wonder how many loaves of bread could have been baked instead of gilding those mosaics, how many bellies might have been filled instead of paying stonemasons and architects. The contrast is striking. For the elite, eternity was stone and mosaic. For the poor, eternity was hunger and survival. Both lived under the same pale sky, both heard the same distant church bells, both feared the same plague. But one group built monuments to their glory, while the other wondered if they would live to see another harvest. And yet, in the long run, it was the elite vision that endured. The Hagia Sophia still stands today, its dome a marvel even to modern eyes. The peasants who starved in 536 left fewer traces, their huts collapsed, their bones buried quietly, their lives remembered only in the thin lines of tree rings and the scattered words of chroniclers. The monument survived, the people disappeared. That is the ultimate contrast of 536, eternity for the few, fragility for the many. A dome that seemed to touch heaven, rising in a world where most wondered if heaven had abandoned them. So, let's take one last walk through the year 536. We've stood in the dim fields of Europe, where farmers stared at pale skies and wondered if the sun would ever shine again. We've marched with armies under banners that fluttered weakly in the cold, while generals dreamed of glory and peasants dreamed only of bread. We've sat in smoky taverns, listening to whispers of apocalypse, and we've stepped into glittering palaces where nobles dined by candlelight as if nothing had changed. We've followed Justinian, the emperor with the audacity to dream of restoring Rome in the middle of famine, riot, and plague. His wars stretched his empire thin, his taxes crushed the hungry, but his laws and monuments endured long after the dust settled. His reign was a paradox, glory written in mosaics, despair written in bones. We've looked at the mystery itself, the strange moon-like sun that hung over the world, and the silence it left in its wake. Thanks to ice cores, tree rings, and centuries of scientific detective work, we know now it was volcanic eruptions that veiled the skies. But for the people of the time, it was divine punishment, Ragnarok, Judgment Day. For them, it wasn't geology, it was fear. And we've seen the contrasts, the aristocrats in silks drinking wine under golden domes, while outside families abandoned villages and searched for scraps, eternity for the elite, fragility for the poor, a cathedral that still stands today while the lives of millions faded unrecorded. That is history's cruel symmetry. Yet there's something remarkable in all of it. For all the despair people endured, they planted seeds even when they thought they might fail. They prayed, they sacrificed, they told stories to make sense of the senseless. They kept going day after day under skies that refused to brighten. And when the haze finally lifted, humanity was still there, scarred, smaller, sadder, but still alive. That is the story of 536. Not just the worst year to be alive, but a reminder of resilience in the face of collapse. A reminder that civilizations bend but do not always break, that people endure even when the world itself seems broken. And perhaps in that endurance there's a kind of quiet triumph. So as you listen now in your own quiet room under your own steady lights, take comfort in the distance between then and now. The sun will rise tomorrow, bright and warm, not pale and dim. Your meals are secure, your world more stable, your sky far kinder than theirs. Let that thought ease you as you drift away, and before you close your eyes, I'll leave you with one gentle question. If they could endure all of that, year after year, under skies that seem to have abandoned them, then surely you too can endure whatever small burdens the day has given you. Sleep well, knowing you are stronger than you realize, and that tomorrow will dawn brighter than any in the year 536.